In-depth football coverage from The Athletic is now just £1 per week. See the link in the description to sign up today. It's one of the most unlikely pairings that English football ever knew. They were the rust bucket club going nowhere, he was the global icon sitting atop the world, but they needed each other. This is the story of how Elton John saved Watford, but also how Watford saved Elton John. Between 1972 and 1975, Elton John released 5 consecutive albums that reached number 1 in the US charts. He was at the very apex of his fame and popularity. Watford, meanwhile, were in the gloom. 2 relegations in 4 years had left them in the old Division 4, and an 8th placed finish in 1976 saw the club sitting at its lowest point since the end of the 1950s. But both shared more than a little dysfunction. John's wild success had come at the price of happiness. Long tours were plagued by drug binges, broken relationships and claustrophobic hotel rooms, and it would be to football that he'd look for normality. You see, Watford had been his father's team. As a boy, he remembered first being taken to games as a 6-year-old, and then as he got older, matches became part of his Saturday routine. He would study at the Royal Academy of Music in the morning and then catch the train north in time for kickoff in the afternoon and take his place on the bend, the curved terrace that once adjoined the Schrodel stand. In 1974, through a Watford supporting journalist, John would learn the extent of his club's financial peril. His response was to organise a benefit concert at Vicarage Road. And so, on the 5th of May, fans paid £1 for a ticket to watch Elton John in concert with his guests, at a ramshackle football ground with 2 broken down grandstands and a greyhound track. John dressed in a frilly bee costume in imitation of the club's Hornet mascot. And during that set that included Candle in the Wind, Daniel, and the Beatles' hit Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Rod Stewart even made an appearance. In return, Watford offered John the chance to invest in the club and to become vice-chairman. Now, in spite of his green and orange hair and his platform shoes, he was made to feel more than welcome at board meetings. And in 1976, after being offered the chance to buy the club, he replaced Jim Bonser as chairman. And what followed was a remarkable ascent. Watford would be in the first division and play in the FA Cup final in less than 10 years. A rise which began with the appointment of Lincoln City's Graham Taylor. Now, this was a coup. Taylor was actually recommended by then England manager Don Revie, and John had to fight off competition from First Division clubs. With a £20,000 compensation fee agreed with Lincoln, and for a year's salary of another £20,000, a ludicrously extravagant figure in the 4th Division, Taylor took control of Watford. The good judgment was plain to see, and so was the ambition. But that wasn't the end of it. Legendary Arsenal manager Bertie Mee would be installed as Taylor's assistant, and just 7 years after winning a League and Cup double at Highbury, he too joined Watford in the 4th Division. They now had a perfect combination. A young, hungry manager who preached discipline and organisation on and off the pitch, and a stern, overqualified assistant who had the credibility to reinforce his message. Now, the other vital ingredient, of course, was John himself. Owners of that generation were benefactors rather than investors, and the appeal really lay in vanity or status rather than any commercial opportunity. So in that era, Elton John held 2 very significant advantages. He didn't need to make any more money, and he was already far more famous than Watford could ever be. Therefore, he wasn't chasing some reflected glory, and as such he had no inclination to be obstructive or overbearing. "I loved being around the club," he would later reflect, "because everything about it was different to the world I usually inhabited." It was football as a refuge. In the years that followed, he would host players and their families at his home. He would spend evenings with Taylor and his wife playing cards, and he occasionally drank with supporters after matches. He was chasing normality rather than stardom, and as a result, it allowed him to be a better chairman. Taylor's autobiography is full of instances in which he benefited from John's generosity, but there are as many stories which describe his unquestioning support and refusal to interfere. It was a glorious time, and Watford shot up the divisions. They also caused one of the most famous League Cup upsets of all time, knocking Manchester United out at Old Trafford. Back-to-back promotions were won in 1978 and 79, taking Elton's Rocket Men to the 2nd Division. In 1982, they were promoted to the First Division, in a season shaped by Taylor's quick, direct football, but lit up by the goals of Luther Blissett and the beguiling wing play of a teenage John Barnes. It was a fairy tale. Years later, John would reflect that football spoke to his competitive instincts and that he enjoyed the challenge of trying to elevate his boyhood club. But he also thrived on the relative normality of the experience. On stage, he was Elton John. At Watford, he was just Elton, the chairman who would travel with the players to away games, once in a while join the five-a-side at training, and who actually took a seat on the substitutes bench for Taylor's first ever game in charge. Now, Taylor wasn't quite so keen about that, and he was worried that his chairman's impassioned responses to the refereeing decisions might reflect badly on the club. In time, though, his boss would be happy enough in the director's box. I was chairman throughout the worst period of my life. Years of addiction and unhappiness, failed relationships, bad business deals, court cases, unending turmoil. Through all of that, Watford were a constant source of happiness to me. Not that football was always welcoming to John. He had publicly come out in a mid-1970s Rolling Stone interview, and homophobic chanting was a common feature of Watford's away games. And it wasn't confined to the terraces either, with Taylor describing some of the muttered slurs he overheard from opposing directors and the general toxicity his chairman often encountered. In 1983, Watford finished second in their first season in Division 1. In 84, they reached the FA Cup final. They would lose 2-0 to Everton, but the occasion is best remembered now for John's tears in the royal box during the singing of Abide With Me. It wasn't the fairy tale ending, but Watford had climbed far higher than they were ever supposed to. Elton John would sell the club in 1990 and become president. In early 1996, he would return as chairman and reacquire his shareholding. Taylor even returned too, first as a sporting director and then as manager. Again, miraculously, he won back-to-back promotions from Division 2 in 1998 and into the Premier League via the playoffs in 1999. Taylor would eventually retire in 2001. He passed away in 2017, but he and Elton John would remain friends for the rest of his life, often phoning each other to swap opinions about Watford's form or the club's direction. John resigned his chairmanship for good in 2002. Today, he is the club's honorary life president, and in 2014, the side of the ground opposite to where he once stood as a boy was renamed in his honour. When the players walk out of the tunnel, at the base of the Sir Elton John stand ahead of kickoff, it's now to the sound of his 1983 hit, I'm Still Standing. If I hadn't had the football club, then God knows what would have happened to me, he wrote in his autobiography. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I think Watford probably saved my life. Tifo is delighted to be able to offer full access to The Athletic now for just £1 per week. Read in-depth coverage of your favourite teams across 10 different sports, provided by some of the best sports journalists in the world. Follow the stories that you care about with closer access and intelligent takes. Whether it's sports news, tactics or finances, you'll find it all on The Athletic, alongside a host of brilliant podcasts dedicated to different teams. So, see the link in the description now. Thanks for supporting Tifo and of course watching today's video.